We really did.
It was like me.
I know it was death to watch, but you guys did good getting sent.
Okay, chapter 2.
It was so hard.
Are we ready, guys? Chapter 2.
I know, I noticed that.
My dad wasn't in my life. He lived in Boston, part of a big, scrappy Irish clan that didn't have much in the world. Dad was a street guy, a real hothead, but as he explained it, if you weren't a hothead as Sally, you might not live to drink your first beer. One time when he was 14, he was walking on his block with his 12-year-old brother when an older guy started hassling him. My father didn't miss a beat, just turned and walked straight up to the guy and punched him in the face. It was on. 15 seconds later, the older guy was pummeling my father something serious. My father turned his head and called to his brother, "Hey, go home and get a knife out of the kitchen drawer, will ya?" His brother didn't understand. "What you want a knife for?" My father whacked the guy in the ribs, then turned back to his brother. "Because if I start losing, I want you to give it to me." My uncle ran home and got the knife. By the time he got back, the fight was over and Dad had won. A not atypical afternoon in the neighborhood. So that was Dad, and that was Dad's neighborhood. I loved the stories, but I would have rather had him around. My mom left him when I was 2. Don't know why they met and don't know why they parted. But I knew this. He had a problem with drugs, and his dad had passed away at a young age, and my father and his 4 siblings grew up without a man in the house. Those 2 things and the hot temper were part of my legacy, I guess. They say the Irish are repressed, but sometimes you repress things for a reason. My maternal grandparents had money. My mom didn't, and she also didn't have a good way of getting enough to support us. She and my grandmother always scrapped about this. Grandma probably could have given her $50,000 to put down on a house and get started in life, but that wasn't her way. She'd give you $10 here and $25 there after much pleading. That infuriated my mother. She felt like she was being treated like a 10-year-old kid. Their arguments were the background noise of my childhood. My mom also had bouts of depression. I can remember finding her in bed at noon and her mumbling to me that she needed a rest. I knew somehow that mommies were always supposed to be up at that time, working or making lunch and not lying in darkened rooms with the drapes all pulled. It got her down. At times she couldn't get her head off the bed. It was as if her body was being weighed down by a special gravity that I couldn't feel. I could see it in her pretty face and her exhausted eyes. After Libby Lake, there would be other efforts to strike out on her own. It seemed like Mom could handle living with her parents for only a year or so, before trying to move away. We moved into a series of bad, crime-ridden neighborhoods, each one sketchier than the last. When I was around 12, we moved to a place 3 hours by bus from my school. I couldn't believe it. I didn't want to leave my friends and my teachers that I loved, but there was no way I could do 6 hours on a bus every day. I ended up not going to school that first day, just stayed home and watched TV. Afterward, my mom drove me back and forth to the new school, but I'd lost interest in the whole thing. I went from being an A and B student to getting C's and D's. There were days when my mom wouldn't even argue when I told her I wasn't going to school, and she'd say, "Hell with it, let's go to the beach, escape to the sand." But besides making me a primo skateboarder, it didn't do much for my education. The next move, when I was 11, was to a place called River Oaks. One of my friends from middle school lived there, and when my mom announced that we had to go somewhere, I told her to go to River Oaks, but that was the only place. It was a pretty rundown neighborhood, but at least I knew someone there. She agreed. Chad, though, wasn't having it. His attitude was, "I'll stay right here with Grandpa and Grandma, thank you very much." I guess he was being smart. It was one of the things that would drive a wedge between us. I protested. "Why do we have to leave?" I demanded. "All my friends are here." "Because we gotta go. I can't stay here anymore." It's not fair, I thought, and it wasn't. But I knew, and my mother knew, that I was coming along with her. I could never leave my mom. If she said, "Brendan, get your stuff, we're moving to the dark side of the moon," I would have bitched for a while, then grabbed my toothbrush and my favorite toy and waited on the front step. I would choose my mom over anything. But Chad was done with us. I had to move to a whole new neighborhood and try to make a new set of friends and avoid getting beaten up without my big brother to help me. Chad was drinking by then, getting into squabbles and becoming part of the SoCal punk scene. He had a lot of rage, and that he got out in his music. He disappeared one time, and my mom told me he was in something called anger management. I thought, yeah, Chad could use that. It hurt when Chad chose my grandparents over us. I think he saw how close my mom and I were. We had that bond that he and she never had, or that they'd lost. He was sad and bitter that I was her favorite. I'm not sure if Chad ever said those words, but I could read it in his eyes. I think it kept him from loving me, to be honest. River Oaks stays in my memory because that's where I smoked weed for the first time. The kids I was hanging out with were passing a joint around one night when I should have been home. When it came to me, I hesitated and said, "Why the hell not?" I put the joint to my lips and took a hit. The anxiety and sadness that were more and more a part of my life began to recede into the distance. I loved weed from the get-go. We lasted a year in River Oaks before my mom had to swallow her pride and go back to Grandpa's. Each time I returned a little more streetwise, a little angrier. 6 months later, I was 12 12 years old, lying upstairs in my bed, reading a book about a boy who survived in the Canadian wilderness with just a hatchet his mother had given him. I loved that book. I imagined I was that little boy hacking off tree branches for firewood and shivering with cold. Voices came up the hallway. Grandma and my mom were fighting. I closed my eyes and tried to block out the sound by humming. It worked for a while. I leafed through the patches of hatchet, humming a little louder when Grandma's screeching voice rose higher. Then I heard my mom say 2 words that caused me to sit straight up in my bed. I'm leaving. I'm leaving? Not we're leaving? Brendan! I heard her call, her voice full of anger and misery. I tossed the book on the blanket and ran downstairs. My mom was standing there shaking, her eyes angry, her mouth tense. Brendan, I'm going away for a while. You're staying here with Grandma. I opened and closed my mouth a couple of times, but nothing came out. My mom walked by me to her room and began throwing some clothes in an old bag. I stood in the doorway. Mom, take me with you, I said. Her back was to me. She zipped up the bag. Zap! I flinched at the sound. Mom, please don't go. I followed her out the driveway. She didn't so much as glance at Grandma, who was yelling from the kitchen. If she wants to go, Brendan, let her. We don't need her here. My mom threw her bag in the back seat of her purple Dodge Intrepid, which had a dull metal shining through where the paint had worn away. She came back to me and bent down and grabbed me and held my body to hers. She must have said something to me, but there was a buzzing in my brain and I didn't make out the words. She stood up, jumped into the Intrepid, and threw it into reverse. 5 seconds later, she was gone in a swirl of dust. When we spoke on the phone afterwards, she tried to explain, I had to go alone, Brendan. I have to try something new. When I'm settled, I'll come and get you. I never really had my dad. I'd lost Chad. I'd lost crazy friends from Libby Lake. And now, by far the worst of all, I'd lost my mom. I sat on the driveway crying until my grandpa came out to get me. He was a gentle, good-hearted man. He patted my shoulder and told me to come inside. I went to my room and cried. She was away 6 months in Oregon. I cried myself to sleep the first 4 or 5 nights and dreamed of the day I'd make enough money to buy a big house, big enough for my mom and dad and Chad and grandpa and grandma. Mom finally came back after being in a car accident where she broke her back again. When you've been left behind as a child, that pain never leaves you. Even if you don't know that memory is there, it is. I would learn that soon enough. My mom did come back. I was happy to see her, but I wasn't the same kid she'd left behind. I had that first toke of weed when I was 12 and I'd liked it. I was getting into fistfights now and then. I hated to see anyone mistreated, and I enjoyed smashing my fist into the face of people I didn't like, bullies, racists, dumbasses. The following year, my mom's birth father, who lived in Prescott, was diagnosed with cancer. The doctors were giving him 6 months to live. She wanted to be near him at the end, so she announced one day that we'd be moving to Arizona. She went on ahead the spring of my 8th grade year. I graduated middle school, then packed up and followed her a week after the 4th of July. I didn't want to go. In fact, I was dead set against it. To a SoCal kid, Arizona is like something out of the Middle Ages. I'd been to Prescott once with my grandma a year before, and I thought to myself, I wouldn't make it even 1 year in this town. Now I was going to live there. Are you kidding? I yelled. There's nothing in Prescott. Sorry, chapter 3. Here we go. Except rattlesnakes and hillbillies. What am I supposed to do there? My mom reminded me that it was her last chance to be with her dad. Besides, it's a chance for a fresh start. I laughed bitterly. Fresh start my ass. Grandpa and Grandma drove me to Arizona. When we stopped for food in one of the mountain passes, I could feel that the air was thinner. My heart raced a bit. The closer we got to Arizona, the more depressed I became. As far as I was concerned, there was a whole lot of nothing east of LA. Roads winding through snow-capped mountains. Town names like Bullhead City and Fort Mojave. We passed through places that looked like they'd close after dinner. No kids, no sidewalks, no damn beach. When we rolled into Prescott, I thought, oh, hell no. The downtown, later I would learn it's called Whiskey Row, looks like something out of an early John Wayne movie. The whole town seemed like a bunch of dirt roads and cowboys. People were seriously walking around wearing 10-gallon hats like it was 1876. I felt out of place before I even got out of the car. I will never live in a little hick town like this, I said to myself. I need sand and water. I'd inherited my beach bum genes from my mother, and I loved heading to the ocean just to letting the waves ease my mind. The desert heat and the high altitude wiped me out. I spent the first couple of days sleeping, depressed about moving to this back of beyond place and starting over again. After a while, I began exploring the town, or what there was of it, and tried to get my bearings. It was shocking how different Prescott looked to me. I was used to hanging out with blacks, Mexicans, Samoans, and anyone else who'd fallen into the California's melting pot. Here it was mostly Caucasians, but not my kind of Caucasians. These people are straight up white. Prescott teens hunted in the hills around town with crossbows and rifles. They knew how to quarter and skin their prey before taking it home. If they bought a pickup truck, and what else would they buy? They knew how to take apart its engine and fix it. They rode broncos and bulls at the town's annual Frontier Days, the world's oldest rodeo, then drank at the bars along Risky Row. The local heroes weren't skateboarders or rappers. They were cowboys, the roughnecks, the undersized 170-pound linebacker from Prescott High who got a Division I scholarship because he was the toughest goddamn player in the state. I spent the summer hanging out at the skate shop across from our apartment block. I was looking for friends, but it didn't happen. Californians have a bad reputation in the small mountain towns of Arizona. Either they're rich, arrogant snobs who pay $3 million for a mansion in the hills, or they're poor SoCal rejects who smoke weed and don't pay their debts. It was tough to live down that reputation. In August, I went to Prescott High as a freshman. Most of the kids there had their friends since third grade. They'd all come up together. I was the outsider with the laid-back accent who wore pull-up black socks, Vans, Dickie shorts, and a flannel shirt. You could say I was a bro dude, half my style bangers of SoCal, half from the surfers of Ocean so well. The other kids were dressed in Wranglers, cowboy hat, cowboy boots, cowboy shirts. My clothes were wrong. My hair was wrong. My voice was way wrong. So I fell back on what I partying. When I was 13, I had my first drink, Sailor Jerry rum and Coke. It was back in Oceanside over winter break. I was hanging out with my brother and his wild friends, and they offered me a cup and then another. After my second, I puked my guts out all over the pavement. My mom had no idea. I was already a little wild. My philosophy was anything worth doing is worth overdoing. I wanted it to be known that Brendan McDonough never backed down from a fight, never saw a party he couldn't take over, and never said never. The first friends I found in Prescott High were exiled Californians like me. We formed our own little clique. I started staying out late, partying in the hills around town. The hills were a good party spot because it was easy to see any cops coming up the roads. They rarely bothered us there anyway. We'd look at the stars, pass around a joint, and talk shit. Through freshman and sophomore year, my drinking and drugging behavior got crazier. My friends got sketchier, and my grades dropped like a rock. My mom was truly unimpressed with me. Not only was I repeating her worst mistakes, I was topping them. I'd stumble in at 2 a.m. on a school night, ripped out of my mind. Brendan, she'd come storming in the room. What the fuck is wrong with you? My mom could really tear into me. I argued for as long as I could before I passed out, and then she was talking to a corpse. But I had another side to me that I like to think I inherited from Grandpa. I still carried within me an old-fashioned sense of duty. If he was in line at a grocery store and there was a single woman who couldn't pay for her groceries, he'd flip the cashier $50 to cover her. He was that type of guy. He looked out for other people. To him, that was just part of being a man. I'd absorbed that growing up. In middle school, I'd volunteered to go to LA and work in one of the biggest big homeless shelters there. I went along Skid Row with some of the other volunteers, handing out sandwiches, offering people a place to sleep and shower, and doing anything we could to get these men and women back on their feet. Skid Row isn't some romantic hobo camp, believe me. It's hardcore. A lot of addiction, bipolar disorder, random violence. I wasn't a church-going Christian, but I knew about Jesus, and I really wanted to live out his message. At the shelter, I bathed and cleaned the feet of homeless men and found them new shoes from truckloads of shirts, socks, and sweaters donated by DC, a skate clothing company. Some of the men cursed at me as I did this. Others thanked me humbly. I was grateful for the chance to help. It doesn't matter how bad your life gets, there's always someone else who's got it worse. In Prescott, I went to little out of the way trailer parks, one of them occupied by World War II veterans who'd fallen on hard times, and cleaned up their yards and landscaped them, putting in trees that would blossom and give the people there something to be cheerful about. I volunteered for the Special Olympics, and at Prescott High, I made a point of standing up for anyone getting bullied. Nothing pissed me off like a bunch of idiots or gangbangers tormenting a kid who was weaker than them. I never gave in. I took a lot of pride in that. Still, I was lost. I didn't know if I wanted to be a drug dealer or a priest. Both had their attractions. The truth was, despite my good intentions, the party monster side of me always dominated. And it only got worse. My mom was working at a plant nursery and took side jobs doing landscaping. She'd managed to rent a house for us by working her ass off, but she was too damn tired to control a 6-foot teenager with a mind of his own. So the party monster won. There was one last thing. Besides the cowboy boots and the pickup trucks and the world's oldest rodeo, that was different about Prescott. You lived with fire. It was always on the edge of around town to get rid of the dry and dead brush that could hit by lightning or touched off by ricocheting bullets. Everyone in Prescott would target shooting in the hills. The smoke would come down the slopes and settle in the streets. You'd be in school learning geometry and you'd start choking on these invisible fumes. Or there'd be a real wildfire and you'd hear the sirens blaring all over town, and the local news would be full of people talking about how close the flames were. I was a beach kid from Oceanside and had no idea what was going on. To me, nature meant fresh marijuana. Still, fire was always with me then. It was like a signal from over the hills that the sun sank behind every night. Despite the buildings and the Thai restaurants and the shopping malls, it said, you are living in the wild. One day, sooner or later, you'll come face to face with the natural world, and the natural world does not play by the human rules. By the time I was 14, my mom was at her wit's end. She began looking around for a way to get me off the druggy trail I was following and found something called Fire Explorers. It's a program designed for teenagers who might think they might want to be firefighters. It could have been for the budding taxidermist for all my mom cared. So long as it kept me straight and narrow, she was happy. The last thing I wanted to do was spend my evenings in another classroom with a bunch of fire geeks, but I went along hoping to get her off my back. On the first day of class, the instructor handed out a textbook, Essentials of Firefighting. It was 716 pages long. I nearly fainted. I've never been much of a reader, and I thought, what the hell am I going to do with this? The instructor finished handing out the books. This is not just another textbook like you get in school. This is the book being used in the fire academy right now. It's life and death. I opened the monster and turned to the first page. This manual is dedicated to the members of the unselfish organization of men and women who hold devotion to duty above personal risk, who count on sincerity of service above personal comfort and convenience, who strive unceasingly to find better ways of protecting the lives, homes, and property of their fellow citizens from the ravages of fire and other disasters. I read the paragraph again. Something there appealed to me, that of service, of sacrifice. I had never sacrificed anything in nothing to sacrifice. We were too broke for that. But here was a profession where I could save others and still live out an adventure. Fire Explorers was the first thing in my life I took seriously. I loved the long, punishing workouts and the push-up contests. I liked the discipline. I even liked the technical stuff. I learned how to tie knots, a bowline, a clove hitch, a figure 8 follow through, a bucket bend. I became a deft hand with an axe. I could search a room engulfed in flames just by touch, although we were never trained with live fire. Even if I was hungover or high or depressed, I never missed a class. I decided I wanted to be part of this brotherhood. I wanted to be a firefighter. But what I was a drug dealer. It was the only way I knew to make a decent money. By 17, I was running a thriving business in pot and pills. If you were looking for score in Prescott in 2010, I may have supplied you with weed or Molly tabs, primo stuff too. I was really good at my job. I had to make money somehow, and being a drug dealer is a great way to make friends. I had clients who were star football players, physics nerds, rich Cali kids. They invited me to their parties. They paid pretty much whatever I asked them to. For a stoner like me, it was a dream job, but my addictions were getting worse. I sampled my own product so much that it seemed I was stoned from morning until I passed out in bed at night. School was an afterthought, and my grades bottomed out. My mom would ground me or attempt to, but she was too worn out from working to chase me down and actually make the punishment stick. My senior year, we ended up living a few houses down from Prescott High. I took advantage of this by running home during lunch, taking a huge rip on my bong, snorting a few pills, then heading back for my glass classes. In mid-afternoon, pick me up. My go-to pills were Oxycontin and Percocet, which I got dirt cheap. One day I took too many hits on the bong and crawled back to school late for the bell. The next period was computer science, a class I was barely passing, and I needed to be in there. I skulked outside the window trying to catch the eye of one of my friends. Finally, one of them spotted me. I gestured for him to open the window, and in the back of the room, he got up, strolled over to where I was, and slid the window open. I was going to go in commando style, hit the ground floor on all fours, and crawl to my desk. With Percocet in my blood, this made perfect sense to me. I managed to pull myself up to the sill, slide my body through without alerting the teacher, but on my way down to the floor, I knocked a chair over. Bam! The teacher whipped around. I was lying on the floor, laughing my ass off. I imagined that I was building my legend, but really I was trying to escape my life, my mom's unhappiness, her screaming at me as soon as I walked to the door about pissing my life away, being a degenerate, and so on. The fact that my father would have walked by me on the street without recognizing me. The fact that my mother would have done the same just because he didn't care to be associated with me. I graduated high school in 2009. With school, my life had some structure, but after graduation, I joined the small Prescott community of tweakers, dealers, and future inmates that centered on Whiskey Row. A typical weekend night from 2010. I was invited to a party at a mansion in the hills, one of the $1 million homes I would one day keep from going up in flames. My friend picked me up in his lifted Toyota Tundra, and I jumped in there with 4 other guys. When we got to the party, the driveway and nearby streets were packed with Lexuses and Porsches. I walked into the mansion, and all I think was, what? There was a dance floor bigger than any apartment I'd ever lived in. A live 4-piece band that could really play. Men with strange masks on their faces and women in dresses made out of shiny patches stitched together with black lace. Guys wearing high-end watches that cost more than pickup trucks. One of my friends went to the bathroom and came out with his eyes wide. Dude, there are hidden cameras in the bedrooms. What? Why? Why? Because this is a swingers party, man. We looked around. All the men seemed to be around 50 and all the women around 21. So obviously at some point in the night, there was going to be a joining of these two populations. We had to think this over. Why had we been invited? And smoked some weed on the patio. It was about 11 o'clock and the deck was thick with people popping pills and swilling champagne. Out of nowhere, I felt something smash into my right cheek. I staggered back and saw a stranger in a white shirt getting ready to hit me again. His eyes were bloodshot and there was a tie pulled halfway down his shirt. My buddies bent the dude over the railing. People were screaming as his feet tilted in the air. Throw him over the railing, one of my buddies yelled. The patio looked over a cliff of scrub, landscaped rocks, and cacti. Toss him. Hell no, shouted another friend. It's 30 feet over there. We dropped the guy back on the patio and turned to see the place in riot mode inside. Inside there was chaos. Chairs arcing over the dance floor, cocktail glasses being smashed on people's faces, figures wrestling in the half darkness. The band was running for their lives. Had the kids figured out what was going on and revolted? I never found out. Didn't matter who started the fight because we knew whose side we were on. My friends and I waded into the brawl, throwing haymakers at the older dudes and knocking 1 or 2 out. Then with bodies scattered across the polished floor, we ran for the exit. It was all good times until it wasn't. By the time I was 18, it seemed no night was complete unless I'd black out or knock someone's front teeth in. Several ended with me being chased by the cops. I even had a fake name, Chad, easy to remember. Then my friends called me on certain nights so that should things go south, the authorities wouldn't be able to track me down. But I still wanted to be a firefighter, and then directly out of high school, I went to the fire academy in Prescott. There was a guy named Tony Sika who was enrolled in a class on structure firefighting. Tony was a local hotshot legend. He'd started out at the bottom working forest fires and he'd built himself up, so now he was leading a Type 2 incident management team, which means you're certified to handle most kinds of natural disaster, even up to FEMA level catastrophes. I told my mom that Tony was teaching at the academy. Mom, who's nothing if not direct, went to talk to him behind my back. That next day, Tony found me in class. I hear you want to be a firefighter, he said. Yes, sir. Okay, but do you want to sit on the couch and watch Lifetime movies, or do you want to actually work? I had no idea what he was talking about. Why don't you become a hotshot? He said. A what? I'd never heard the term before. Shows how clueless I was. We fight forest fires. Sometimes we're out in the woods for 2 weeks at a time. You're choppered in with some chaw and your gear and you live in the wilderness and you actually work. It sounded like heaven. I'm not saying Tony whitewashed things, but he definitely emphasized the good parts of being a hotshot, the camaraderie, the outdoor life, the nonstop action. He also made it sound easy. I was so green I thought, wow, you get paid to go out in the forest and kill big ass fires? Sign me up. I would soon learn how wrong I was. I didn't want a desk job. I didn't want to be supervisor or a captain or a chief. I just wanted to start out as one of the youngest firefighters in Arizona history and put in 25 years of hard work fighting every kind of blaze there was. I wanted to be the kind of veteran with 2 knee replacements that some young buck calls Gramps one morning and asks what time he's due back at the retirement village before I leave him gasping on a brutal mountain run. A grizzled old bastard who tells stories around campfires about the wicked fires he's fought, who's earned the respect of everyone. That was the sum of my desires, to be a firefighter's firefighter. In the spring of 2010, I was on my way. I was enrolled in an EMT course, which every structure firefighter has to pass. My mom had been hired at a fire service station out near Chino, working the front desk at their main offices. I'd taken a wildland and aced it. I felt like I was ready to start. My lifelong difficulty with book learning finally caught up through high school without ever learning to study. I was quick and had a good mind, but I just couldn't sit with a book in my lap and read. I'd never been diagnosed with ADD, but I was always convinced I had it. Maybe that was the origin of my boyhood nickname, BB. As hard as I tried, it seemed my eyes jumped away from the page before I got the sense of what was on it. But I don't want to blame some disorder. I didn't push myself hard enough to overcome that. Whatever the reason, halfway through the EMT course, I flunked out. This derailed all my plans to join the Prescott Fire Department. I saw my buddies finishing the class and getting jobs with the fire departments and and crews. Believe me, it was depressing as hell. Then I remember what Tony Sika had told me, and I realized the hotshots aren't required to pass an EMT course. I was so relieved. Here was a way to brotherhood, the last way for me. My mom kept an eye on the openings at a Type 2 crew station in Chino to let me know when they were looking for guys. She put in a good word with her bosses at the Arizona State Forestry, which ran that particular crew. I'm a shoo-in, I thought. I knew I'd be good at the job too. I felt like all I needed was one clean break and I'd be done with drugs forever. When the time came, two of my friends and I applied for open slots at different Type 2 initial attack crew, basically highly trained firefighters who are among the first responders to a fire. I checked my application twice before sending it in. In 3 months, one of my friends told me, we'll be out on the line killing fires together. The competition was intense. Every other kid in Prescott grows up wanting to be a firefighter, at least the kids I knew, the ones with no college degree and parents who barely making it themselves. The cowboy jobs are gone. The Army and Marines take you away from your families for months at a time. Everything else is minimum wage jobs, but being a hotshot, that was the dream, and the slots filled up quick. A month later, the list for new hires was out, and I went to the forestry station to confirm that my name was there. I was feeling good. This is the first day of the rest of my life, I thought. Like my mother, I'm addicted to the feeling of fresh start. But before I even got to look at the names, a supervisor pulled me into his office. Brendan, I don't know what happened, but you're not on the list. We'd really like to hire you, but if your name didn't show up, my hands are tied. I was dumbfounded. How was I not on the list? Can you call the Forest Service and find out what's going on? I asked. The supervisor shook his head. Even if it was a clerical thing, they won't let us take you. They'll tell us to go back to an old list and hire from there. It's procedure. We found my application, went over it, lied my line. There it was on page 2. I'd mistakenly clicked 1 semester of training instead of 1 year. One little pull down question and I was done. It was my own damn fault. I was completely gutted, but I didn't want to whine about it. I appreciate your time, sir, I said to the supervisor. If anything changes, feel like you're floating face up in blueness. But for me, everything. I got in my car and cried my heart out.